We're going to start. Did I start? I did. You got prayed for. So we are doing the snippet now. And so you guys will see what happens in the morning group when I'm standing in front of this group of people that like to watch me on YouTube. And you're going to do the snippet, and that's the Hagar story, Twice Told, 2 columns. If you get that out, we'll be ready. Now, the way I got this, a lot of the information that I'm going to share with you tonight, and that you're going to learn tonight, from the pastor at the church that I was doing my seminar at a couple of weeks ago in Maine. And he was a tremendous pastor. If I lived in Maine, I would go to his church. And he really looks at Scripture. He looks at the text. And even though some of his conclusions are different from mine, he looks at the text. And so I can really enjoy what he has to say and look at it from a different perspective and say, wow, I hadn't seen that before. So that's what we're going to do tonight, something that he showed by looking at 2 texts side by side. And that is the Hagar story, and then the Hagar story told again in chapter 21. So we have really 2 Hagar stories, which tells us that this is an important story in Scripture. This little maid, servant, really slave, is important. And so the author is going to have us look at her 2 times. So what we're going to do is I want you, Bob, would you read it out loud for chapter 16. We are going to look for 2 things, and some of you have done this before, but it's okay. You're going to look for anything that has to do with seeing and anything that has to do with hearing. So circle, see anything that has to do. So if you see the word eyes, E-Y-E-S, that has to do with seeing. So you're going to circle that. And then we're going to look at some of those same words found in the next story, because the author is going to link these 2 stories, because he's going to base one truth on top of the previous truth. So would you read that, Bob, for us, chapter 16?
Is it Sarai?
Mm-hmm.
Abram's wife took Hagar, the Egyptian woman, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. He came into Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when she saw that she was pregnant, her mistress became quite in her eyes. Sarai said to Abram, "The wrong done me is upon you.
Is this the snippet?
Gave my maid
Go ahead.
into your bosom. But now that she sees that she is pregnant, I have become of like worth in her eyes. May Yahweh see justice done between me and you." Abram said to Sarai, "Here, your maid is in your hand. Deal with her however seems good in your eyes." Sarai afflicted her, so that she had to flee from her. But Yahweh's messenger, angel, found her by a spring, eye of water in the wilderness, by the spring, eye on the way to Shur. He said, "Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence do you come? Whither are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from Sarai, my mistress." Yahweh's messenger said to her, "Return to your mistress and let yourself be afflicted under her hand." And Yahweh's messengers said to her, "I will make your seed many, yes, many. It will be too many to count." And Yahweh's messenger said to her, "Here, you are pregnant. You will bear a son. Call his name Ishmael. God hears, for God has heard your being afflicted." Now she called the name of Yahweh, the one who was speaking to her, "You, God of seeing." For she said, "Have I actually gone and seen here after his seeing me?" Therefore the well was called, "Well of the living one who sees me."
Okay. Now, what we were doing was circling anything that had to do with seeing or hearing. So whatever that was, if you guys can kind of catch up. What we're going to do then is, Dee, would you read the second column? The same thing goes. We are looking for the things that happened in the first column that's also in the second column. So seeing and hearing and anything else that you notice that is comparable to the first column, please take note of. Okay, so Dee, would you please read Genesis 21?
Once Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian woman, laughing. She said to Abraham, "Drive out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not share inheritance with my son, with Isaac." The matter was exceedingly evil in Abraham's eyes because of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not let it be evil in your eyes concerning the lad and concerning your slave woman. And all that Sarah says to you, hear her voice. For it is through Isaac that seed will be called by your name. But also the son of the slave woman, a nation will I make of him, for he too is your seed." Abraham started early in the morning. He took some bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, placing them upon her shoulder, together with the child, and sent her away. She went off and roamed in the wilderness of Beersheba. Now when the water in the skin was at an end, she threw the child under one of the bushes and went and sat by herself at a distance, as far away as a bow shot, for she said to herself, "Let me not see the child die." So she sat at a distance and lifted up her voice and wept. But God heard the voice of the lad. God's messenger called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the lad, that where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and grasp him with your hand, for a great nation will I make of him." God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went, filled the skin with water, and gave the lad to drink. And God was with the lad as he grew up.
Okay, lots of seeing and hearing, right? And so when we look at that first column and start taking note of all the things that are seen, you see that everybody sees something. we see that Hagar sees that her mistress is of light worth. And we see that Sarai recognizes that her servant is not looking at her with respect. And then, of course, Abraham sees that he's in the doghouse. But we have this story about seeing and seeing, and the author is trying to get your attention with all this seeing, so that even when he comes to, there are two Hebrew words for well. One is ayin, and the other is beer. Now, he uses both. But at the beginning, when he's trying to get your attention, he uses the word ayin, which can be translated not only well or spring, but E-Y-E. So it's almost as though he's saying the eye of a spring, or like the eye of a needle, or the eye of a hurricane. So that's what I wrote down on your papers, so that you would realize that the Hebrew word for spring is also the word for eye. Later on, he's going to use the word beer because he's already made his point. What is he leading up to? Why is he emphasizing this seeing all the way through to the climax? What? Go ahead, Nancy.
Because she names God the God that sees.
Mm-hmm.
So seeing is important. The concept that God sees you
Right.
anywhere, no matter what.
Yeah.
So that's the promise. It's his
So-
character.
So he's preparing us for seeing that as the climax. Oh, everybody's seeing, but who's the important one seeing?
God.
It's God who's seeing.
He's the only one hearing.
And he's the only one hearing, because what is her child going to be named? Which means
God of hearing.
God hears. right? The God of hearing. And so, so we know that she's afflicted, and yet God is going to send her back to her affliction. Far cry from what some Christians in the past and in the present are saying about Christianity. It's not a bowl full of jelly beans. There's affliction that we might have to go through. But now she goes back. She doesn't argue with the messenger of the Lord, does she? She doesn't go off and do her own thing. She returns, doesn't she? How does she return? With what? How is she different? How is going back now going to be different?
Because she knows that God sees her.
And
He'll be with her.
And hears.
He'll bless her too, and hears
Yeah,
her.
he hears.
Right, yeah.
He sees
He
her,
hears.
and he hears that. That makes all the difference in the world to Hagar. And now she can go back knowing that she sees and he sees and hears her. And one of the things is this story was so important to me too through the time of Rachel. And I just kept going back to this story. God sees me. God hears me. I believe that. And it was a wonderful thing. Now, the author says, okay, that's not enough. I need to really teach you again, because he always is teaching us more than one time. And so he brings back the Hagar story again with slight differences. What were the words that you saw that were dependent almost upon the previous story in chapter 16?
Say that one more time.
Okay, what words were in common besides seeing and hearing? I know you know. What? Saw, okay. The seeing and hearing saw. The eyes, right?
The well of water.
The well. That word for well in this column is beer. B-E-E-R. What else did you see? Anything else that was the same?
Speaking to her. God said speaking.
Crying.
But that's not the same as the first column. So, how about the messenger? Or angel?
The angel.
The angel is the same. There's a slight difference, though. Did you notice that?
The messenger versus the God's
Yeah. Both are messengers
God's-
of who?
God's message.
In the first story, it's the messenger of whom?
Yahweh's.
Yahweh. In the second story, it's the messenger of?
God.
Yes, of El, God. And so there's a difference there. We have to ask ourselves,
why is it?
why? I'm so glad. I love it when people come up with that question, why? It's my favorite question, and I have that question too at so many, important places, and that's why I can talk to you, because I had the why question. So, okay, if you look at the end of the first column, well, at the beginning of the first column, what is God called at the beginning of the first column? Yahweh. But look at the end when she starts talking.
Living one who sees me.
Yes, but
God, you
you gotta see it. She calls him God, Elohim. She calls him God, Elohim. Now, the whole time in the second column, which is all about Hagar and her son, what's God's name there? Elohim, right? Elohim. Why the difference? Who thinks that they can maybe?
One is a provider, and he's his role changed.
The roles change.
Yeah.
Okay, you've got that. Now, what is Yahweh used for all throughout the Old Testament? Who is he?
The God of Israel.
The God of Israel. He is Yahweh, the covenant maker with Israel. So he's the covenantal God. That is Yahweh's name. So with Abraham and with Sarai, he's Yahweh. But for Hagar, he's Elohim. And for Hagar's son, he is Elohim. Even though he makes a what with Hagar's son? Yeah, it's a different kind of covenant. It's not the covenant he makes with Abraham, is it? It's still covenant. He's still going to take care of them, but it's a different kind of covenant because he's made one kind of covenant with Israel. You are my people. You are my son. in fact. He tells them. But with Hagar and with Hagar's son, it's a different kind of covenant.
Yeah, he totally did not say he blessed the world with her seed.
Right. and her seed, yes, the world will not be blessed through her seed as through Abraham's seed. Yes. Did you notice that it's twice we're told about that covenant? First it's called, I will make him a nation. And then what does it say later on down below?
Great nation.
Great nation. So and then look at the ending. And God was
With the lad.
with the lad. What's going on here? Here we have Abraham, father of a great nation, and there's going to be that Yahweh, covenantal God with him. But he's also doing it for what?
For Ishmael.
Yeah.
Following Florida's covenant.
Yeah, he's going to make a
Right.
covenant with them. They're not of Abraham's line, right? Well, Ishmael is partly of Abraham's line, but it's still going to be a different kind of covenant. But he's still caring for an Egyptian handmaid and her son who is half Egyptian. So almost from the very beginning, we have this thing going on with God concerned with his people, but also concerned with
His grace.
his grace is concerned with people who are not of Abraham. Which is going to befuddle his people all the way through and going to mess things up when Jesus comes and when the book of Acts comes, because they're not going to want to accept the Gentile, and yet from the very beginning, Abraham's slave is being accepted by God, isn't he? Did you notice somebody doesn't get a name in this whole story? Somebody who's a character in this story does not get a name in this second column. Who's that?
Sarah.
No, Sarah's in there.
Sarah.
In all that Sarah says to you.
Ishmael.
Yeah.
Or Ishmael.
Ishmael.
Right, yeah. Oh, different.
Now, wait a second. This is really a story about him because did you notice? Her son, lad.
Right, okay.
The child, lad. It keeps on going, all about the lad, but he's not given a.
Name.
What was his name?
Ishmael.
What did his name mean? God hears. Okay, he's playing with us. I hate to say it that way, but he is.
Yeah.
This is supposed to be fun, and so you're supposed to be asking yourself, "Why isn't he giving him Ishmael's name?"
Because
Well, he
his
really
name
does.
won't be greater than Isaac's.
That could be.
Than Jesus in the long run.
Okay, I understand that point,
Right.
and there might be a reason for that point. Lad, he's not as important, I know, as Isaac will be, but I also think that there's another point there, because later on, it's, did you notice that, watch what it says, she says, let me not see the child die. Do you see that down there on the lower half? Okay, let me not see the child die. So she, what does she do to him? She kind of shoves him.
She put him
What?
in
How old is Ishmael at this time? How old is he?
7.
No?
Past
You think
13.
that? He's 17.
Yeah, he's past 13.
He's about 17. So he's no little child. The word lad and child can be used for an older child too. And he's about 17. So what has happened is he's leaning on her, right? Because he's dying of
thirst. Oh,
now
Susan.
is thirst, right? He's dying of thirst. So is she, and it's not because Abraham did not provide enough water and food for them. He's the father. He's going to provide enough water and food for them. What happened? It ran out. Why?
They drank too much.
they could have drank so much, but what happened?
She left her provision.
Okay, but she had to. She was
Well,
thrown
she was
out.
thrown
She was thrown out. So what happened?
Well, said she was wandering around.
She was wandering around. So she's what?
Lost.
Lost. She's probably, and this is an educated guess, looking for that well that she came to the last time. the one Bear Laharoy, which is the living one who sees me, right? So it keep going. It says, now when the water in the skin was at an end, she, what? He's leaning on her, and so I know it sounds like she just kind of, but she's getting him off. Okay, so she has to kind of shove him off or throw him off. It's almost a harsh word, but she's trying to get him off of herself. But where does she put him to show it's not harsh? In the shade, under a bush, right? So she's had enough food. Abraham has provided enough food. She's gotten lost. She's been practically carrying this big 17-year-older on herself, and she pushes him off, but at a place where he's shaded, and then she does what?
Goes a distance of a bow.
Right, and then she does what?
Cries.
She starts crying. Watch what it says though. But God, what?
God's messenger.
Heard
The voice of
who?
him, the kid.
The lad. Now that always used to strike. Wait a second. Who cried out?
The son did.
The son did.
Yeah.
But it doesn't just stop there. God heard the voice of the lad. God's messenger called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard what? The voice of the lad." Why does he hear the voice of the lad? Why doesn't he say, "I heard your voice, Hagar"?
Well, you already heard her.
Because the promise was to the lad.
Which was? Oh, I see what you mean. The covenantal promise. Yes. Okay, that's included. Yes, but what else?
Maybe she's not calling on God and he is.
But it says she wept. Okay, and he's practically dead, but
Well,
he does
she's-
weep.
She
But
used to
dealt
up
with
her
God.
Keep
voice
going.
and wept. But it doesn't
She-
say what she said.
She's dealt with God before, so
She's
she knows
dealt-
he sees
so-
and hears.
so she knows that he
Okay.
sees and hears. Okay. Why does the author record that God says, and he does, I heard
The voice of the lad.
the voice of the
We
lad,
already know he hears Hagar. Now we know he hears Ishmael too.
Ishmael, because what does his name mean?
God
God
hears.
hears.
God hears.
Mhm.
His name isn't present, but what it means is present. See, takes out the name, but puts in what the name means. God hears. He heard the lad. That's what his name means. So see how he's playing with you and playing with the words in order to get you to see, oh, it's Ishmael, and God hears Ishmael, right? I love that when you see that. So I saw some things. Did you see some things I wouldn't have seen before just by comparing these two stories? God hears.
She gets kicked out because of her disrespect of her
In the-
mistress.
Right.
And so she's disoriented and feeling sad and goes off by herself. She gets reoriented to God.
Right.
And he puts her back in her right place.
Right.
And she goes back, and she must have at that point had respect for Sarah
Right.
because she was accepted back.
Yes.
This second process begins because she's lost respect again. For Sarah.
Oh, wait a second. It doesn't say that.
Ishmael's
What
laughing at-
Ishmael has laughed. Now let me explain to
She's
you.
allowing him.
He's 17 years old and he's left. I think we have, a situation in which Sarai saw something that could be a problem, but he's the one who left, and yet God still hears him. That word for laughter has a slight problem with it because it can mean laughter. He left. But it also can have sexual connotations. So it may be that he did something sexually wrong. Could be. We don't know. Made a sexual remark. Did a sexual something. We don't know. Or it may be that he just laughed. Doesn't tell us. But Sarai sees this is not good. She reacts very
Probably been
vehemently.
building, and whatever he did gave her an excuse.
It could,
She probably
could,
hasn't been
could.
wanting to share anything. with him for a
Except
while.
that I think you may be right, but even so, God respects what she had to say, because remember when it says when Adam here, you listen to the voice of your wife, and so therefore, you've sinned, and you get the consequences. Well, here's the same words being used, only positively. God says to Abraham, listen to the voice of your wife, because she's speaking wisdom. Even if you are right and she's speaking out of anger and resentment and anything like that, she still is knowing that this kid has to leave. And
He
God
might have
says,
been
go ahead.
jealous of Isaac.
Could have been
Oh.
very easily. Yes. Yes. Okay. So snippet done. Great, you did a good job. I wanted you to see all that. What you can do when you start to see two stories that are alike. It's a narrative type scene. For those of you in Maine who are just learning, you've got two stories that are quite alike. I would call them narrative type scenes. And the same furniture is in both. And so you put them side by side and start looking for the common elements and then seeing what's different and why. So, okay, last week a lot of my people got lost in the dust. They really did. So, I decided to go over some of the things and also add a lot of things to it concerning this Ezra passage and Nehemiah. Remember Nehemiah 3? I think some of you felt like, So we're going to put the story in its place, because Ezekiel plays an important role in what Luke decides to include in his gospel. So we have, we've seen that we have a theme. Go back to our theme, Luke 24. We're going to be looking at this all through Luke chapters 1 and 2. And by the way, for those of you online and those of you here, this is our last week until January. So in January, we're going to go on to chapter 3 of Luke. Now you're probably saying to yourself, well, Barbara, you usually spend a lot of time on every text in a book that we're doing. Well, this time I didn't do it that way. What we've done is look at it through the eyes of Luke chapter 24, verses 25 and 26, which I want to read right now. Remember, they're on the Emmaus Road, and these men are talking after Jesus has resurrected, and they're saying, we're confused. And so in verse 25, Jesus said to them, O foolish men, and slow to heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory? Then beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. So we have looked at Luke 1 and 2, not verse by verse, but from the perspective of Abraham. Remember when we went back and Luke's 1 and 2 sound so much like the Abraham stories, right? Then we looked at it through the eyes of Daniel, and we went to Daniel. And we saw, oh my goodness, he's even referring back to Daniel. And it looked as though Daniel was the undergirding of Luke 1 and 2. And then we looked at it through the eyes of David. And we said, oh my goodness. And there's David. It looks like everything is from David. And then last week we said, well, we're going to look at it through the eyes of Ezekiel and Nehemiah. And we did not get to Luke. So we're going to do that this week. But we're going to start with Ezekiel. So get out your Ezekiel paper from last week, if you remembered to bring it. Where is my paper?
43:25.
So Ezekiel 43, 1 to 5. Yes. This one. If you don't have it, know, from, I put notes. I think what happens when I send you those lovely little emails in which I tell you how much I love you and things like that, you say, oh, I can skip through that and just hit the button, the attachment. And so you don't read through the message, and sometimes I do have a few important details in that message besides that I love you. So you do have it. Good. Okay. Yeah, we're going to read. You don't have it,
She does, but I can read it.
so you can
I'm so sorry.
share it.
I'm
You
trying
can
to
share
figure
it.
out.
We're going to underline, circle 3 words. What are the 3 words?
East,
East,
gate,
gate, and
glory.
Glory.
glory. These are the important things. East, gate, and glory. Then he led me to the gate facing toward the east. And behold, the glory of God of Israel was coming from the way of the east. And his voice was like the voice of many waters, and the earth shone. What does that remind you of?
Light, glory.
Yeah, shone in this world. What shines?
Sun.
Sun, okay. So it almost looks as though we have a sunrise coming up here, doesn't it? And that's important. The visions were like the vision which I saw by the river Chabar. Remember in chapter 1 when God's limo comes to Chabar. And I fell on my face, and the glory of the Lord came into the house by way of the gate facing toward the east. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court. And behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house. So you got those 3 words repeated over and over and over again. And we have to ask ourselves, why? So I'm going to start back, way back with Abraham. Now, we got to start in the east. And what do we know about going east or the east? It's not good. Okay, so remember that. Going east is not good, but coming from the east
Is good.
is good.
But no one
Okay,
wants to say
Vera,
going
I don't
right
know whether
west.
you knew about this before, about going east being bad. But remember Adam and Eve, okay? They went east out of the garden. The door was on the east side. Cain goes east of Eden. Okay. Those who built the Tower of Babel traveled where? East. When Lot was given a choice between the north or the south, where does he go? East, which tells you right away he's not doing a good thing, right? So, and whenever there was punishment, you were sent
East.
So when Jacob is running away from Esau, he goes east,
Northeast.
right? Northeast, but it says east up in the but it was up toward the middle of the Fertile Crescent. So, but we're going to start in the east with Abraham, right? Where is he located in the east?
Chaldees.
Of the Babylon or the Chaldeans. So because Chaldeans and Babylonians are the same. Okay, so we have, I have to limit myself here because, me, I like to go like that. We have Abraham starting in the east, but what does he do? He travels over the what?
Fertile Crescent.
Fertile Crescent, so he's not, downward, at Fertile Crescent, so he's not going east, he's coming from the east to,
West.
to the Promised Land, right? But he stops someplace right up here.
Haran.
Haran. Leaves some of his family there, and years later, this is not good, but years later, he finally comes down into the Promised Land with Lot, right? So he's there. He has 2 sons. The first son is
Isaac.
Ishmael's first.
Ishmael's first through Hagar. I know. I trick so many people that way. Yes, he is considered, Isaac is considered firstborn, even though he's born second. But he's considered firstborn. Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac has twins. Who are they? Yeah, right. Jacob is, Esau is born first, but he loses his birthright. He loses being called firstborn. And who is the firstborn then? Jacob. Firstborn merely means the one born first, but it also means the one who gets the inheritance. So if the inheritance isn't going to go to the one born first, the one born second or third or fourth who gets the inheritance is called the
Firstborn.
firstborn. That's why Jesus is called the
Firstborn.
firstborn of all creation. He's number one. He gets the inheritance of all. So okay. So we have him coming over, and we have Isaac having Esau and Jacob. Jacob has how many sons? 12 of them. Through what two? Rachel and Leah, and
Their
the
handmaids.
two concubines. Right. Two concubines. He has 12 kids. Don't forget Diana. She's the girl.
Right.
So, but anyway, one of those sons, the 11th son, is sold by his brothers. And where does he go?
Egypt.
Egypt. Now, this is a bad thing. Why isn't he going east?
Because he was taken down there as a slave.
Yes,
He's not going away from God.
he's not going away from God, and he's not being punished by God. When you're punished by God, you go east, just like Adam and Eve and Cain going
Wow.
east. See, but so God needs you to know that Joseph is not being punished by God. He's being sent down to Egypt. So that's one of the reasons. So he's down there he and his brothers finally come. They're down there for how many years?
400.
400 years. Good. Some of you just know it. I know that this is all, perhaps Dick and Jane to you, but it's good to go through it again. And some of you need it. Okay, so they're down there 400 years, and then they come up out of Egypt with whom as their leader?
Moses.
Moses, right. So Moses is going to be in the wilderness now, though, for how many years? 40 years. So he comes up, and let me show you. This is the Egypt, Israel, right? And right down the middle of Israel is a river. What's that? Jordan. Now, Moses and his people could have come right up here from the wilderness here. But they don't. They swing around and they come up here on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And this is really important because, it has to show that they're coming from the east into the land. Now that becomes important later on, so remember that. What's the first city that they come to?
Jericho.
Jericho. So Jericho is on this side of the river, the right side to be on. They have come through the Jordan River. Now they're on in Israel. Okay, so they're there, and under who did they follow in order to get into Israel? The Canaan. Joshua. Why? Moses died because he didn't believe God. And so we have Joshua, and all during Joshua, things are going great. They're conquering the land. They're getting rid of the Canaanites. Everything's going great, but then Joshua dies. And everything goes downhill. And what's the book that we studied last fall?
Ruth.
Oh, Ruth, yes.
Judges.
Maybe it was the before last fall. What was it? The book before Ruth.
Judges.
Judges. It's terrible, black, horrible period of Israel's history. But in the midst of it, we have a diamond. And what was that story? Do you remember?
Ruth.
Ruth, in the midst of it. So we have Ruth. After Ruth and the last of the judges, we have three kings. And they have a united kingdom. Who were those three kings? Saul, David, Solomon. Now, remember Solomon's sins. He goes after idols, doesn't he, because of his wives. So God says in his son's time, there's going to be a split. So now we have, what is that called?
North and south.
Yeah, divided kingdom, northern kingdom, southern kingdom. Now, I'm going to help you, for those of you who don't have it together, because it took me years to get to where I am, where I know the difference between the northern and the southern kingdom. I want you to think of the northern kingdom as being A, because A is on top, and the southern kingdom as being B. Okay, so A, B, north, A, southern, B. Okay, now where is Jerusalem and the temple located?
And B.
In B. Good. I'm glad you remember B. In B. And so is the Davidic king. But how about the northern kingdom?
Not one good king.
Not one good king, and none of them are what?
From Judah.
From Judah or from David. Right. You're right. None of them are from Judah or David. And so they go, and the first king of the northern kingdom, Jeroboam, sets up what?
Calf.
The two calves, right. And so right away you know that the northern kingdom is not going to be good, right? So you got your A, you got your B. Years later, God sends two prophets to the northern kingdom. Does anybody know those two prophets? Elijah and Elisha. Right. Okay. So now you know in your mind during this period of the divided kingdom, we have Elijah, Elisha. Finally, God says, had enough. So let's go over that Fertile Crescent to up here.
Syria.
Assyria. What does Assyria start with?
A.
A. So Assyria comes over the Fertile Crescent right to A. Okay? And takes A into captivity. And A is first, right? Okay. So we now know that Assyrian captivity caught the northern kingdom, which was A, and took them into captivity. Now, Sennacherib, who came over from, I know that's a Sennacherib. You ever hear that name? Okay. He comes over and he's going to do the same thing to the southern kingdom. And so he lays siege around the city of Jerusalem. Right. But Hezekiah, a Davidic king, is inside, and Isaiah tells him, go pray. And he goes to the temple and he prays, and guess what? God answers his prayer. And Sennacherib's troops have to go back because there's been a plague and they've been called back. And so he never defeats the southern kingdom, Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's still there. But God keeps saying, did you see your sister? What happened to your sister is going to happen to you if you don't follow me. But what does the southern kingdom do?
Their own thing.
They did their own thing too. And they went into idolatry too many times. So we have this divided kingdom. The A kingdom goes into Assyria. Now God says, okay, I've had enough of you, southern kingdom. And so down below here, we have Assyria here, starting with an A. What do we have down here? B, Babylon. B, Babylon comes over and takes B of Israel up over here. Now this is where it gets good, because this is where Ezekiel comes in. He is during the Babylonian captivity. And what's important about that is that, remember, they're over in Babylon and they have two big problems, two big questions. The first is our God, did he lose the war? Because they lost. And in their thinking, in that world's thinking, it wasn't Israel and Babylon fighting with each other. Who was fighting with each other? The gods of Babylon and the God of Israel. And so who won?
Well, the Babylonian.
It looks like the gods of Babylon. So they had that question. Aren't you stronger than the gods of Babylon? You know, what happened? The other question was, is our God land-bound? Is he only the God of Canaan? Are we alone without our God here? Two questions that Ezekiel 1 answers. Because what happens in Ezekiel 1 is God's limo comes along. Mm-hmm. And did you all read that again? Because I sent that. Okay, God's limo. God travels from the tabernacle, from the temple in Jerusalem, over the Fertile Crescent, down to the river Chebar in Babylon, where who is stationed? Who's at the river Chebar in Babylon? Israelites, right. Now, he's answered those two questions. How did he answer question 1? Is our God weaker than the Babylonian God?
Well, he's got quite an impressive limo.
He's got an impressive limo. But what has he been able to do with that limo?
He's traveled
Travel where?
to Babylon.
To Babylon. How can he get into Babylon if he's weaker than the Babylonian gods?
He can't.
He can't. So what must he be? Stronger than the Babylonian gods. He got right there into Babylon. Is he land-bound? That's the second question.
No, he left one place.
He left one place and traveled to the other quick as the wink of an eye. Yes, see the two questions that Ezekiel 1 answers for these people in Babylon? Their God is stronger than the Babylonian gods. And it wasn't because he wasn't strong enough. It was because they were wicked enough to be put into Babylon. Right. So that's what. Now, Ezekiel later in chapter 43 describes Yahweh coming back to his temple. That's what we just read. Ezekiel 43, 1-5. Now, after the Babylonian captivity, the people are allowed to come back to the land under Cyrus. And they do. Cyrus was the Persian king. He sent them back. He said, you can go back. Zerubbabel is the first to take them back. But then Ezra comes back. What does he want them to do when he comes back? Build the temple. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that so important? Of course, it's the most important thing in Israel, but I think there's another reason why the temple is so
Because that's
important.
where God will draw.
That's where God is going to come back, because Ezekiel says he's coming back to that temple. And then Nehemiah comes with a group of people, and they rebuild what? The walls. And that's when we get it, Nehemiah chapter 3, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is what we read last week in Nehemiah chapter 3, was that we have Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem. And so on the west side, right, because this is the east side, the west side is all gates. And what's at each of those gates? 5 gates on the west side.
Bolts and bars.
What's missing from the gates on the east side? No bolts and bars. Now, see, I read that 1,000,000 times in order to find these things, because what is Ezekiel 3, according to me? The most boring chapter in the Bible. If you read it and you're not understanding it, but if you read it, comparing and seeing what's there and what isn't there, you find out that there's bolts and bars on the western side, but no bolts and bars on the eastern side. Now, compound with that with the next thing that you find out. Who's living on the eastern side? All along the eastern side, who's there?
Priests and
The priests and the Levites. Why are they there? Why are there no bolts and bars? Hold on to that. Not only that, but look at I want you to go either on your papers with those columns with the gates. Do you remember last week? You had the columns. Okay, if you don't have the columns, go to Nehemiah 3. But if you do, go to Nehemiah 3. Well, and verse 23 on your second page of those 3 columns each. Okay, if you go to Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 23, and I looked it up in the Hebrew, and it's this way in the Hebrew, it says this: after them, B and H, I'm just giving the first letters so you don't get befuddled by the names, carried out repairs where? In front of the house. Which means, where is their house facing? East. Their house is facing east. So not only are they situated on the eastern side of the city, not only are there no bolts and bars on the eastern side of the city, but now the priests and Levites have their houses, what?
on the wall.
Facing the wall. Facing the eastern wall. Look at it again, because it keeps being said. Look at verse 24. After him, B, the son of somebody, repaired another sake. Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to go there. Look at verse 28. 28. Above the horse gate, the priests carried out repairs, each in what? Front of his house. Keep going in verse 29. After them, Zadok, the son, carried out repairs where? In front of his house. Okay, go down to verse 30. After him, H, the son of S, and H, the 6th son of Z, repaired another section. After him, M, the son of B, carried out repairs where? In front. So they're all facing the east, aren't they? All the Levites, all the priests are facing the east with even their houses facing east. And so we have to ask ourselves,
Why?
why? Because Nehemiah is not going to answer that question. He's just not going to. He expects you to have turn off CSI, expects you to have turn off MTV, or whatever else that you watch, or HGTV, and he expects that you know Ezekiel 43, which says what? That Yahweh is going to what? Come from the east, toward the east, toward the city, from the east toward the city through the what gate? The east gate. Yeah. And then go where?
To the
To
temple.
the house. the courts.
Yeah, the court at the temple. Right, the house. So they are waiting in expectation. They've got the temple all done. They've got the walls all repaired, all ready for Ezekiel 43 to be answered, fulfilled, satisfied. They are waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. Over 400 years they wait. It's a long time to wait. And when it does happen, what happens?
They don't get it.
They don't get it, do they? They don't see. And so now, I told you, Luke is based on this. Now we're getting to the meat. Luke is based on this Ezekiel passage. And so, from the very center of, before the center of the book, because how many chapters are in the book? 24. And so we are going to chapter 9. So open your Bibles to chapter 9. Chapter 9 in Luke. I get excited. I'm sorry. This is exciting. I've taught this 3 times today, and I still get excited. Luke chapter 9, because Luke gets it. Luke gets it. In fact, my brother-in-law is the one who told me this. He's a scholar. He's professor of Bible in Western Kentucky University. And he says Luke is based on Ezekiel 43. What Jesus does is based on Ezekiel 43. So go to chapter 9. Now, if we were to go to the middle of the book, what chapter would we be in? 12. We're in chapter 9. So before even the middle of the book, we start with this. Watch what happens. Go to Luke 9, verse 51. And it says this: when the days were approaching for his ascension, he was determined to go where?
To Jerusalem.
To Jerusalem. That happens at the end of his life. We're starting right here in chapter 9 with him setting his face toward Jerusalem. Then go to verse 53, right below. But they did not receive him in Samaria because he was what? Traveling toward where? Jerusalem. So he's already got you started. He's going toward Jerusalem. So he's up in Galilee. He's going to come to Jerusalem. It's already started before the middle of the book, and he keeps on going, the trek. It's his inexorable trek toward Jerusalem. Go with me to chapter 13. He's done a lot of parables and teaching, but in Luke chapter 13, go to verse, please, 22. In 13, 22. It says, and he was passing through from one city and village to another, teaching and
Proceeding on his way to Jerusalem.
proceeding on his way to Jerusalem. We're still continuing on that inexorable trek toward Jerusalem. None of the other Gospels does this. Luke 13:33. Nevertheless, he says, I must journey on today and tomorrow and the next day, for it cannot be that a prophet would perish outside Jerusalem. So he's saying, I'm going toward Jerusalem. After chapter 13, go to chapter 17. In chapter 17, verse 11. While he was, it's almost like, well, there it is again, while he was on his way where? To Jerusalem. Look at that. Go to 1831. Then he took the 12 aside and said to them, Behold, we are going unto what? Jerusalem. He keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's the sunshine. He's the one who's going to rise and go into Jerusalem, like the setting sun, like the rising of the sun in Ezekiel. So then after 1835, go to 19:1. And he's on his way. What does he enter? Jericho. Okay. Now remember I had you over in Jericho? I got you, get your picture. The children of Israel cross over from the east, because they have to cross from the east. That's how you enter the land. You come in from the east. And so now Luke records that Jesus is in Jericho. But he doesn't just do one thing, story in Jericho. Jericho is here, Jerusalem is over here. He has two stories about Jericho. The one is like the other two synoptic stories, and that's about Bartimaeus. Okay? But he has a second story there, almost as though he's positioning Jesus right where we know he ought to be, right to the east of the city. And so the next story is about Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, right in the city. And then he starts moving toward Jerusalem. So watch how that goes. In verse 19:11, it says this: While they were listening to these things, Jesus went on to tell a parable because he was near Jerusalem. And then in verse 28 of chapter 19, after he had said these things, he was going on ahead to Jerusalem. Now watch what happens next, because he's just been in Jericho, but he's moving again. And where is he moving toward? He approached what? Two cities, Bethpage and Bethany, near the mount that is called
Olives.
Ah, right. So he comes to the mount. This is the Mount of Olives here. Along the Mount of Olives on this side, on the east side, is Bethpage and Bethany. He says, okay, there's no reason to mention them except that he's passing through on his way from the east. And he's going over the mount and he gets to the top. And what happens next? He tells his disciples to do what?
Get the colt.
Get the colt. Why does he need a colt?
To enter on the colt
On the colt. Why?
into Jerusalem.
Why?
The king's son.
Right. Zacharias tells us what about the future Messiah? He's going to
Ride
on a donkey. So here he is from the east on the Mount of Olives, and he's going to ride on a donkey, and he comes down, and what did the people do?
They gave him parade.
Hosanna.
Yeah, right, the Hosanna. They start celebrating.
Right.
Why?
He's finally coming.
He's finally coming. How do they know? He's coming from the what? East. And not only that, on a colt. So they know two things about Scripture. That Messiah, the Lord who is coming, Yahweh who is coming from the east, going to be riding on a colt. And so they start laying out their cloaks and putting down palms, and they're ready. They are ready. They're singing hallelujah. And then in verse 41, again it says, and when he approached what? Jerusalem. Where does he go? He's going up the Jericho, east of the city, going from the east up the Mount of Olives, through two little towns called Bethany and Bethpage, gets to the top, gets on the donkey, comes down. He's acclaimed. They shout hallelujah, Hosanna to the highest. He comes up to the top of Mount Zion, to Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, where does he go first? To the temple. Just like Ezekiel said, Yahweh is going to do. He's going to come from the east and go into Jerusalem through what gate? One of the eastern gates. He doesn't specify, does it? But he goes through an eastern gate and goes immediately into the temple, just like Ezekiel's passage says. That is what Luke is about. It's about Yahweh coming to his temple. But what does he find there at the temple?
Money changers.
Money changers. They're not ready for him. It's horrible. And so they're not ready. So what gets put aside?
They
The
do.
Messianic kingdom.
The Messianic kingdom. It's not done away with like our millennial friends would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not done away with. It's put aside for a time because they reject him. The next time they're not going to reject their king. Because remember what Acts says when